Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the reprise of Dr. Adam Greer's talk on the Gulf of Mexico in the Evening Skidaway lecture series. Tonight we'll be hearing from Dr. Greer, who has a bachelor's from Vanderbilt University and a PhD from the University of Miami, both in biological sciences. And tonight he'll be telling us about some of the things he's learned while he's been working in the Gulf of Mexico over a number of years prior to coming to Skidaway. Thank you, and enjoy the talk. Dr. Greer.
Well, thank you, Clark. Appreciate that. And thanks everyone for being here. Today I'm going to be talking to you about an ecosystem that I've been studying for about 13 years. It's hard to believe. But during the time that I've studied the system, I've come to kind of realize that there's a lot of lessons we can learn from the Gulf of Mexico, because it's an area where our influences as humans have a really broad reach. And there's also just a lot of fisheries productivity, a lot of different industries that all converge in this environment. And so what you're seeing here are two images from different parts of the Gulf of Mexico. On the left side is an area very close to shore where you see a lot of sea foam. The water is very turbid. This is evidence of the river influence that's really prominent in the nearshore Gulf of Mexico. It's a very productive environment for fisheries. And then further offshore, you see this clear blue water that is very low in nutrients. But in the background of both of these photos, you see oil rigs. And so oil and human influence is a very big part of the nearshore and offshore Gulf. And so what are we talking about when we talk about the Gulf of Mexico? It's a marginal sea, which means it's outside of the main oceanographic basins like the Atlantic and the Pacific. It's one of the largest marginal sea. And the main features of the Gulf are this point of entry where you basically have very clear water. This is going to look like water from a swimming pool coming in from the Caribbean Sea. It's very low in nutrients, and it works its way around the Gulf. You have a nearshore current that goes the opposite direction. And there's this unstable feature called the loop current that can extend far up into the Gulf, but it can also be very shallow or very far to the south. And it occasionally will spin off little eddies, which are just circular motions of water. And in the northern part of the Gulf, we have heavy influence from all sorts of different rivers. And you'll notice from this map that there are really large areas that are really light in color. That means it's very shallow. So you have large continental shelf areas. In contrast to what we have in Savannah, where we have really large tides, in the Gulf, we have really small tides. And so it's heavily influenced by the amount of wind onshore or offshore. And of course, there are many states that border the Gulf with varying amounts of coastal areas. And today, I want you to kind of just take away three main messages about the Gulf of Mexico. The first is that there's a lot of different habitats that have different stressors. This depends on whether they're close to shore or in deep water. And then there's this heavy influence of freshwater outflow in the north. And I like to call this the double-edged sword of freshwater influence, because it is very much responsible for productivity, but there's also a lot of stressors associated with it. And then there's ubiquitous economic activity when it comes to fishing, oil rigs, shipping. It's a heavily worked body of water, the Gulf. And so human activity within the Gulf and upstream introduce all these stressors and policy challenges, and yet the ecosystem persists. It's a very resilient system, and we'll learn about why that is today. And I kind of want to just plug this book that I read right after I moved to the Gulf Coast. It's kind of an environmental history book. But if you're interested in any of these topics and kind of what led up to them, this is a great book. After I read it, it won the Pulitzer Prize, so it's nice to see my opinion of it validated by the people who make those decisions. So kind of taking a big step back, talking about the ingredients for ocean life. These are all the primary producers at the base of the food web. And so they have a lot of different looks to them. Sometimes they form chains of cells. Some of them actually have little flagella that allow them to swim around. And some of them form these colonies that are inside of a kind of a mucus or a gelatinous matrix. And so all these different types of phytoplankton basically need these two main things. They need nutrients and they need light. Kind of like primary producers on land, you need both things. And so the way that this happens in many parts of the world that's responsible for very productive areas of the ocean is that you have deep water that's essentially isolated from the light. It's really full of nutrients. And in a physical process, basically wind pushing water in a certain direction offshore has to be replaced by this deep nutrient-rich water. And when that rich water hits the light, you basically get high biological productivity. And so from this physical process, we basically can get huge numbers of fish. And so what's actually happening in this area where you see this little fishing boat catching lots of fish? So once you have that high light environment, or sorry, that the nutrient-rich water hitting the high light environment, you basically get chains of diatoms that look like this, and they start reproducing like crazy because they can just divide. There's a lot of good conditions for them. And that's really good for the grazers like plankton from SpongeBob, who's roughly based on a copepod, which is one of the most abundant marine invertebrates on Earth, about the size, about a millimeter long, really tiny, but they're really, really abundant. And so these things are eating the phytoplankton, and so they are doing really well too. They start reproducing. And that leads to this, this fish called a menhaden, but it's part of this broader group called forage fish, and they eat the zooplankton. And so what is kind of unique about these forage fish is that they form these massive schools. And so wherever in the world these schools form, you get really high production of all other fish that are basically relying on these. And so that's also pelican food. And then seabirds, other fish eat them. And so menhaden has been dubbed the most important fish in the sea because it's at this very critical point between what's happening in the plankton versus what's happening in the fish and all the populations of marine animals that we make management decisions around. And so we talked about upwelling, but another really important nutrient source is river runoff. And this is a picture from where the Mississippi River meets the Gulf of Mexico. And so on this side, you have very turbid water, really high in nutrients. Over here, you have less nutrients. It's very clear water. And you see that sea foam forming at the interface. That's indicative that it's a really good habitat for the phytoplankton, the copepods, and of course, menhaden. And so if we look at the footprint of all the freshwater influence in the Gulf, it's really a huge chunk of the United States from Great Falls, Montana, all the way over to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and everything in between. A lot of our food is grown in this area, and so anything that ends up in the river ultimately ends up coming out at the base of the Mississippi River around New Orleans. And so not only is there a huge amount of river influence from the Mississippi, but this showing here is the continental divide of the United States, this orange line. And so wherever rain falls in relation to this line, it will end up in the Gulf if it's on the western side, and it'll end up in the Atlantic if it's on the eastern side. And so many of you may know that Mobile, Alabama is one of the rainiest cities in the country. And so all the rain that falls in Alabama and Mississippi, or large parts of Mississippi, ends up in the Gulf as well, and a lot of smaller rivers that empty in there. So this fresh water is full of nutrients naturally, but what we do in cities, farms, also influences what ends up in that river that's eventually ending up in the Gulf of Mexico. And so there's a lot of different fish species that hang out in the Gulf because there are a lot of different habitats. Some are reef associated, like this red snapper and the gag grouper. There's a lot of really profitable nearshore fisheries, including shrimp, the brown, the white, and the pink shrimp, our menhaden, which is used in fish meal and fish oil. And then this is a redfish, which is a really popular sport fish, and then also for eating. If you've been to New Orleans, you might have had redfish. And here is the essential fish habitat for redfish or red drum. And so you can see that it very much hangs out in these nearshore waters where there's a lot of river influence, particularly around Louisiana. And we'll talk about this area a lot as we move on. And then further offshore in the Gulf, you have bluefin tuna that are spawning out in the open ocean. And there's a lot of these migratory pelagic fish that use the Gulf for various reasons. And so just like we can rank college football teams, we can also rank ecosystems based on how productive they are. And this is exactly what these two fisheries scientists did. And it kind of helps us understand where the Gulf ranks in terms of how productive it is. And kind of a general pattern is that the further north you go in the United States or North America, you tend to get higher biological productivity, but lower numbers of species. As you move towards the equator, you get more species, but less productivity. So clearer blue water that we kind of think of as being in the Caribbean. And so you'll notice from this chart that the North Pacific is basically 1 and 2 in terms of primary production, estimated biomass, fisheries landings. And so that's a really productive system. And this is like up in Alaska. But one of the good comparisons here is actually the South Atlantic, which is basically off the coast of Georgia. Same latitude as a lot of the Gulf, but the Gulf is actually a little bit more productive in terms of primary production. Has number 2 in terms of fisheries landings and fisheries value, and so it's a really productive system. In addition, it's very biologically diverse, and so what this graph is showing is that there's a high percentage of fish stocks that we basically don't know if they're overfished or underfished, because there's a lot of different species. Some of them are transient, moving through the Gulf, and so we just don't have a lot of information about them. And so basically with the Gulf, we have really high biological diversity because it's a subtropical system, but relatively high biological productivity as well. And so I kind of like to think of this little graphic that the North Pacific is like Mike Tyson, and the Gulf is definitely smaller, but in my view, it it punches above its weight, let's say. And so other things about the Gulf that I think are pretty neat is that it's a songbird migration pathway. And so there's a lot of birds that nest and breed in the summer in the Southeast US, and then they winter in South America. And if you're out there at the right time, as I was in 2016 in April, right off the coast of Mobile, Alabama, we had this prothonotary warbler, which is a songbird that landed on our ship for a little rest break, probably as it was making this long trek across the Gulf. And then it ends up in the Southeast US for the summer. And then in terms of fisheries production, it really fuels a lot of these seabird populations that are there all the time, like pelicans and great blue heron. So far we've only talked about the good things in terms of freshwater influence, and now I'm going to kind of shift to the other side of the sword, where these are the things that could be not as good for the ecosystem. This includes too much nutrients in the environment, then also we'll get into some cases of freshwater diversions. And so I've only talked about basically the good phytoplankton, the diatoms that help the copepods proliferate, but they're not all the same. And so there's some species that have really potent toxins, like this Carinia brevis. It's a dinoflagellate. It's the red tide organism. They have 2 flagella that actually help them swim around, which is kind of neat. And as many of you may know, this is the mascot for the Alabama Crimson Tide. His name is Al, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because he's an elephant. And so I'm going to propose right now that we change the mascot name to better reflect the team name. And we're going to call him Honest Al. And so he's a dinoflagellate now, Carinia brevis. He can even keep the trunk because, it's like a flagellum. He may not be popular with the kids, but at least they'll learn something about what a crimson tide really is. And so when Honest Al gets in the environment, it can be pretty devastating. These are some pictures that I took just off the coast of Mississippi, and it kind of looks like that frontal feature that we saw earlier, but a lot of these are actually dead menhaden. And so you can kind of see in this picture these little fish. I must have seen about 600,000 dead menhaden that day. It was just remarkable everywhere because of this red tide that made it to the coast of Mississippi. And so when I was working there, I had some colleagues who wanted to answer this question as to why this red tide made it all the way to Mississippi, because a lot of times they originate in the Gulf Coast of Florida, but they don't make it all the way around the entire Gulf. And so what this is showing is the nutrient concentration. So remember, this is kind of the fuel that the phytoplankton need to grow on October 29th. And the color, if it's basically if it's blue, it means there's lower amounts of nutrients, and then red means higher amounts. And so nitrate and phosphorus are shown here. And then what happened was that you basically had this the remnants of a hurricane that went over the study area. And then what happened after that was a really high amount of nitrogen showing up in the system. And because basically the remnants caused all this rainfall to happen in the Southeast US, that meant a lot of fresh water coming out, and then this big pulse of nutrients. And so these researchers had data on where the high counts of this red tide organism were. And so what this plot is showing on the right here is the points geographically where they saw really high counts of this red tide organism, and the color represents like a timeline. So cold colors mean earlier, and then warm colors mean later. And so you can kind of track where they started seeing the bloom in terms of the date. And this down here is actually where they used a satellite algorithm to look at the ocean color and see where this bloom was. And so you'll see that there's this kind of critical point where the bloom starts getting close to Mobile Bay. This is Alabama. And then all of a sudden, really close after that, you get it basically proliferating all in the Mississippi Sound and Bight. And so that corresponds really closely when this nutrient pulse happened. And so it was basically the timing and the physical force of this bloom being pushed to the west, and then coincidentally, this pulse of nutrients at the same time basically allowed this bloom to show up in an area that it normally doesn't usually make it. And so if we can think about freshwater also as a stressor, we talked only about kind of these systems where it leads to a lot of production, but what if there's a really, really big pulse of nutrients at one time? Well, that's going to make these phytoplankton start dividing really quickly, and they'll start dividing really, really quickly. But you have to remember that, so this makes plankton from SpongeBob happy because he has a lot of food to eat. But you also have to remember that he's a copepod, and so he can't just divide into two. They have to like carry eggs around, and this takes a long time. And so basically, plankton from SpongeBob can't reproduce as quickly. And so what happens to all this excess food in the environment? It just kind of sinks out of the environment. And so that's when you basically have these diatoms moving from this highlight environment into the deep water, and that's when microbes take over. These are just decomposing things. Same thing that happens if you throw a piece of fruit onto your front lawn, it gets decomposed. That's basically what's happening in the ocean when these dead phytoplankton sink out of the water column. And during this process, they're consuming oxygen. And so this happens on a really large scale in the Gulf, particularly in the summertime. This is showing the extent of a hypoxic region. And so hypoxia is low bottom oxygen water. It's defined by being less than 2.0 milligrams per liter. And what this is showing is that the colors represent how frequently these areas go hypoxic. And so you're seeing that these places right near where the Mississippi River comes out are going hypoxic quite often. As you move further from shore, it's less hypoxic. And this is often referred to as a dead zone, but really it depends on the organism. When you have things like fish that they need a lot of oxygen to survive, you have them almost completely removed from these low oxygen areas. But things like gelatinous organisms that have lower metabolic rates don't necessarily have to avoid it. And so this extent every year depends really on the nutrient input and also the stability of the water column, which we'll get into here. And so what I'm showing you here, it's a lot to kind of take in, but I'm showing you data from a towed imaging system that's shown up here on the right. And this is a 1,000-pound instrument. It has a bunch of sensors on it. And basically, we tow it behind a ship, and it goes up and down through the water column, and it measures temperature, salinity. But it also takes pictures of plankton that you see here. And so this in the middle is a larval flounder. I actually have an example of one that I'll pass around so you can kind of see for yourself what they look like. This one that I have here is actually from the South Atlantic Bight, but it's a little bit older too, but it's the same kind of thing that you would see. And then we have a moon jelly here, and then a tube anemone that's eating a gelatinous organism, and then our friend the copepod, which is like the SpongeBob. And so the data I'm showing you here, you have depth on the y-axis and distance. And so this is kind of like a cross-section through the ocean right off the coast of Mobile, Alabama. And so you're seeing 3 different seasons where we sampled the exact same transect in fall, spring, and summer. And so you'll see this is a salinity and a color here. And so the water is very well mixed in terms of the salinity. And as we go into spring, that's when a lot of the rainfall happens. You get a lot of freshwater runoff. And you see this signature of that in the surface water where it's very low in salinity. And then in the summertime, that runoff's already happened, and you basically have two water masses kind of sitting on top of each other. And so it's a very strong change in the water density between these two layers. And on the right side, we have actually data from the camera. So it's actually showing the abundance of particles or plankton that were detected by the camera system. And so you can see very low abundances here, a lot of high abundances in spring, and then a lot of those particles are kind of isolated to that interface between the two water masses. And so I'd like to have the camera give us all these pretty pictures like the ones you see here, but in reality, in the Gulf of Mexico, super productive system, most of the time we see things like on the bottom right here, which are marine snow aggregates. These are dead, decaying phytoplankton. It's organic material. Sometimes you see shrimp that are attached to them and actually eating the aggregates. And so this is basically happening in the summertime, where you basically have a lot of this high organic material reaching down below that interface between the water masses. And so it's low light because these particles actually block a lot of the light. So it's low light, and then you just basically get a high amount of organic material being decayed, and that draws down the oxygen. And so in summertime, or sorry, in fall, when it's well mixed, you basically don't get that effect because the water is basically able to re-equilibrate with the atmosphere, and so you don't get low oxygen. And so the extent of this hypoxic area changes quite a bit from year to year. This is 2017, and the top left is the second worst ever in terms of the extent of the hypoxic region. Here's the most recent one. And this graph here is showing the area of the hypoxic region through time. And so you can see it bounces around quite a bit, but it hasn't really gotten worse or better. It's just really noisy. And so how would a tropical storm impact hypoxia? You'd essentially go from that two-layer system I talked about in the summer to something really well mixed. And so if a tropical storm goes over the study area before the survey happens, you might see very low hypoxia than if you happened when there weren't many hurricanes around, because that two-layer system gets kind of broken up by high wind events. And so if anyone of you have been to the Gulf Coast, you know that a lot of these cities are very close to sea level. And because of that, we have to kind of manage the water, especially when the river gets really high. We can't let places flood. And so this map is showing kind of where there are different flood control areas. And the one I want to really talk about today is this Bonnet Carré spillway, which was constructed in 1931. And what it does is that it takes Mississippi River water, instead of letting it go through New Orleans, it diverts it into Lake Pontchartrain, and then it goes this direction. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but because of the way the Earth rotates, a lot of this Mississippi River water actually tends to go to the west. And so this area over here does not get much Mississippi River water. And so what you have in this situation is that the Bonnet Carré spillway actually diverts a lot of Mississippi River water into an area that normally doesn't get it. And so that can have pretty bad consequences. And when this happens, of course, it basically turns the Lake Pontchartrain and a lot of the Mississippi Sound and Bight into a really high freshwater environment. Really just too much of it, because you get a lot of dead dolphins, a lot of them have lesions. And so, there's a lot of dire consequences for excessive amounts of fresh water, but it's a really difficult situation because you can't really let New Orleans flood. So you have to do something with the water. And so, like I said, the spillway opened in 1931, and it's only been opened 8 times in the first 70 years. But recently, it's been opened a lot more frequently, including 2019, where it was open back-to-back years and for a total of 123 days in 1 year. And this graph is showing the average global temperature and then spillway openings. And so it's not a great correlation, but you just can see that recently there's been a lot more frequent openings. And then this costs the state of Mississippi about $215 million in lost seafood industry, because the oysters die. A lot of other nearshore fisheries are basically inaccessible because it's just too much fresh water in that environment. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to kind of change up and talk about oil and its impacts on the environment. And so here I'm showing you where exactly different oil platforms are located. And most of them occur, each dot is an oil platform. And so you can see that there's a lot of more platforms off the coast of Louisiana and Texas and Mississippi. And if y'all have ever seen these platforms, they look like really little cities. There's a lot of light, there's a lot of activity, a lot of helicopters and things going in and out. And they're a very important part of the coastal economy in these areas. And if you remember back to what we talked about before with hypoxia that happens off the coast of Louisiana, also red drum end up in this environment as well. You basically have all these things coming together. We have a lot of oil extraction, a lot of hypoxia in the summertime, and then you have essential fish habitat for a lot of economically important species. And so it's worth taking kind of a moment to talk about why or how a lot of this oil ended up in this environment. And so this schematic is kind of showing how oil forms. And it starts with plankton about 300 to 400 million years ago, basically sinking out and forming a new layer of sedimentary rock. And then there are other rock formations that form on top of that over millions of years. And eventually you get a rig that goes down through this, what we call a cap rock, which is basically a rock that does not allow the oil and gas. So I forgot to mention that once this, this layer forms, it's under a lot of temperature and pressure, high temperature, high pressure, that forms a lot of these hydrocarbons. That's the oil and the gas that we see today. And then you extract it by going through this impermeable rock so that oil and gas kind of percolates up, it gets trapped under that rock, and then the drill goes through it to extract the gas and the oil depending on what you want to get. And so I like to think of oil kind of as the ghost of plankton's past, where, you know, it's this old life form that's undergone a lot of changes, but it's still around, and that's basically the fossil fuels that we get now. And so oil is really a feature of the Gulf of Mexico. This map is showing where all the major oil spills have occurred throughout North America, and the size of the dot corresponds to how big the oil spill was. And so the big dots are clearly Deepwater Horizon and this other one called Ixtoc 1, which I'll talk about. But there's a lot of other spills that happened directly as a result of hurricanes. And there's also a bunch of natural seeps in the Gulf. And so it's possible and likely that the Gulf of Mexico, particularly the northern part, is kind of primed to have a bunch of microbes that can actually break down oil-like forms in a certain amount, because there are these natural seeps of hydrocarbons that come up through the sediment. And so before we get into kind of the major oil spills, I want to talk about this one that's lesser known, that had a big influence on me as a scientist when I was living there, because it was just shocking that it was occurring. Taylor Energy was this company in Louisiana, oil company, and they had a platform in very shallow water. So this is the Deepwater Horizon is this, I don't know what you call it. It's like a white star, and then this yellow dot is showing where Taylor Energy was. And during this hurricane, Ivan, in 2004, this oil platform essentially had this underwater mudslide come through and rip it out of the ground. And then after that, there was a leak, basically. And they calculated that about 4 million gallons had been spilled between 2004 and 2017. And so this spill went on for a long time. It was really hard to figure out who was going to fix it, who's going to pay for it. And you know, a lot of oil spilled between that time period. And for reference, you know, Deepwater Horizon was obviously much bigger, but it occurred on a shorter time frame. And so I actually went to this site in 2017 when it was still pretty bad. And you can kind of see, this is a picture I took with my phone. You can see the oil sheen kind of at the surface. And it definitely smells like hydrocarbons. So it wasn't, you know, it was just kind of shocking to actually see that was still going on. Here's another picture and some scientists going out to where the leak was actually at its maximum. And so this is from September 19th, 2017. And so this is actually kind of a good news story, because although it was really bad that it went on for a really long time, there was this group, Cuvion Group. It's a private company that was awarded a grant in collaboration with the US Coast Guard to build this system to try to stop this leak. And so what they did was they developed this 200-ton system that sat on the capsized rig and would essentially gather the oil, and then they would collect the oil from this vessel that had an ROV on it, and it would go down and occasionally like empty out the oil, and then they actually were able to use that oil still. And this study or this grant was funded by this oil spill liability trust, which was initiated after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and it's supported by funds from the oil industry. And if you're interested in this, there's a really cool like 13-minute clip on 60 Minutes about this. If you just go on YouTube and search Taylor Energy 60 Minutes, it's really informative because they actually talk about how this system works and why it was successful and all that. And so if we go back to our map of oil spills, I'll talk about the big dots now on this map. One is this one that I had actually never heard of until I moved to the Gulf and started working on oil spill research, called Ixtoc-1. It's the second largest oil spill in North America. And it happened just off the coast of Mexico in the Bay of Campeche. And when this oil spill happened, you can see it was really influenced by that current that comes into the Gulf and then loops around this way, or clockwise. And so the oil, when it started leaking, it actually ended up off of the Texas coast pretty quickly. And there's a lot spilled, huge loss of marine life, and still ongoing effects that are being studied today. And so Deepwater Horizon was somewhat similar in that it was this rig. It was in deeper water, though, and there was an explosion, and it was just a really difficult situation because it was really hard to actually know how to stop it. And so this is just pictures of the actual explosion. 11 people lost their lives that day, and then you could see oil coming up pretty quickly after that. A somewhat controversial decision was to apply dispersants to the surface oil, but then also at the wellhead itself. And so the application of that dispersant was, the idea was to try to help it break down quicker so that it wouldn't make it to the coast. If we look at where the oil went, this is just from the surface. This map is showing the concentrations of oil. You can see the location of Deepwater Horizon there in the middle. It kind of stayed, for how much that was spilled, it didn't move around nearly as much as the Ixtoc-1 that went right up the coast to the Texas. But of course, there was still a lot of negative effects. You can see the numbers here: 82,000 seabirds harmed or killed, 6,000 sea turtles, 25,000 marine mammals. And this is the average volume of surface oil between the day the spill happened, or roughly around it, until it was capped. Just this map kind of just shows some of the immediate effects. There was this patches of dead coral, and they were covered in this brown substance at the time, was kind of alarming. And then there were dead animals found in a lumpy sediment layer offshore. And then they had these baby dolphins washing up on shore, a lot of premature births that happened as well. And so there are a lot of effects of the oil spill. Some were easier to connect to it than others. And then we have to also keep in mind there's some really acute effects that look horrible. And then there's also effects that are a lot harder to see, that are chronic in that population, such as the dolphins and things like that. And fortunately, the loop current wasn't extending that far north during the time the oil spill happened. Otherwise, it could have had a much larger footprint. And so we've only seen kind of the 2D effects, but it's really a 3D process because the spill is happening from the rig down deep in the water. And so essentially what happened is you had 50% of the oil go to the surface, and about 50% also in this deep water plume at about 1,000 meters depth. And there was also this interaction with the biological components of the Gulf, where you had, we talked about phytoplankton and marine snow. You had a lot of dead, decaying phytoplankton actually sinking through this plume, and then it became what was known as MOSPA, which is marine oil, snow, sediment, flocculent accumulation. Anyway, it's an acronym. It just means that the marine snow and the oil are kind of mixing together and exporting that oil to depth. And only 10% of it actually made it to the shallow Gulf shelf, which includes the beaches and the marshes. And this picture kind of shows what I'm talking about when it comes to that material that made it down to deep water. You can kind of see this sort of greenish flocculent material. That's from this kind of marine, or this MOSPA marine oil snow that was sinking down through that plume and into these benthic habitats. And so why was dispersant used? And it was really, the idea behind it was to help the oil-eating microbes. So this figure is kind of showing how dispersants work. When they're applied, it basically makes the oil form little tiny droplets, which gives the oil a lot of surface area for the microbes to colonize it and start breaking it down. And so that can happen when you apply dispersant, but there's also a biological process that happens, it produces a similar effect. Some of these oil-eating bacteria produce this exopolymeric substances, which is basically a carbohydrate that's kind of sticky, and it forms these little droplets as well. And so the end result for both of these, whether it's dispersant or this natural process, is that you get a lot of this MOSFA, or marine oil snow, kind of raining out of the surface. And so, yeah, that's basically what I said. And the dispersants, the controversial aspect of it was that they have their own negative effects on life forms. There were tests done prior to them actually deploying them, but because of the time frame, it was like a really tough call, because the goal was to keep the oil off the coast. And given that, some pretty tough judgment calls had to be made. So what happened to all the oil? Small droplets, some dispersed naturally, a lot chemically dispersed. Then there was a bunch that formed these surface slicks and tar balls that sank down to the bottom or kind of washed around the surface. And then some evaporated or dissolved. And then a lot was also removed by emergency operations. And so about 20% overall sank to the bottom or made it to the shore. And so there's been a ton of work on this topic. What was the consequence, or all the consequences of the oil spill? And kind of the rule of thumb, or kind of this major theme that's emerging, is that the closer to shore that the organism was, the faster it recovered. The deeper water, it tended to not recover as quickly, or there's a lot of unknown effects. And then on the other hand, if something is longer lived, it seems to be that they're slower to recover from the oil spill. And so just some examples: the blue crab lives inshore, produces a ton of eggs and larvae. It matures at 1 to 2 years. And so this is a fishery, a lot of nearshore fisheries recovered quite quickly. But then things like dolphins, I talked about earlier how there was a lot of kind of developmental abnormalities. They don't produce that many young, and so the recovery or the effects can actually have a really long tail, I guess, as far as how long those effects are able to be seen. And then a lot of these deep water coral communities that basically got that MOSFA marine snow raining down on them are really old, and they're really slow to grow because they don't get a lot of new propagules that just show up there that often. And generally, the colder and the deeper you get in terms of the ocean, the slower all metabolic rates are. The rates of everything kind of slow down. And so the breakdown of oil is slow, and then the recovery of a lot of these systems is slow. And there's also this kind of alarming decrease in the deep water fish and invertebrate biomass after the spill. And in these environments, again, they're a little bit more stable because they're not influenced by freshwater runoff. And so when they get some really big perturbation, like an oil spill, it's a type of effect that these systems may not be used to. And so the toxic effects of the oil might be more prolonged. And a real common theme from all this oil spill research is that there was not a lot of baseline data, particularly these deep water and mid-water habitats that are not well monitored. We just didn't have a ton to go off of in terms of understanding the effects of the spill. And so just to recap, we talked about the key role of fresh water in the Gulf of Mexico, and this is kind of what connects our activities on land to what happens in the Gulf. This fresh water is really important for biological productivity and upstream effects or influences from land runoff, and then also local influences when it comes to how that fresh water is managed, where it goes, how much goes to a certain location can be really important. And then, of course, we saw the acute effects of the oil spill and then the recovery, and how there are many long-term effects that are still kind of difficult to measure and are still being studied to this day. So the take-home lesson from the Gulf, in my opinion, is kind of that the timing, the magnitude, and the causal relationships of all these different components of the ecosystem really matter if we want to understand the impacts. And we saw this with water management, with how the river input influences blooms of algae and hypoxia, then also the timing of hurricanes, and then, of course, how the oil spill influenced the ecology of the Gulf. And so just to finish up, this is a quote, perhaps unlike any other ecosystem in the world, the Gulf of Mexico is subject to a regular procession of disturbances that include hurricanes, hypoxia, and sizable salinity shifts in nearshore environments due to rain or drought. And so this suggests that the Gulf is a very resilient system because it undergoes such a wide variety of conditions. But a lot of other marine ecosystems that we care about may not be so resilient. So it's really important for us to understand how all these different parts of the ecosystem work and how our behavior or what we do on land can influence all these different parts and how they interact. And so with that, I'll leave you with a Gulf sunset and take questions. Thank you. All right, you don't have to ask questions. Oh, okay, yeah. Well, as far as, I think there were some behavioral effects. I'm not really sure exactly what they were measuring. They were definitely looking at kind of they tested it on 2 different organisms and didn't see anything like alarmingly bad about them, but I don't really know the details of exactly what the dispersant
Yeah, I was wondering
did.
if it was like biochemically, it was ingested, and messing with the physiology, or was it like a physical problem for the organisms?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I don't really know.
Okay. Yeah, just wondering what we'll do next time something like this happens. Do you think we've learned enough from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill to make some changes next time?
Well, I think Deepwater Horizon was uniquely bad. It was a really difficult situation. I would think now we'd be a little bit more cautious about the dispersants making it down into these deep water habitats, knowing what happened. Because, like I said, the priority was to keep the oil off the coast, because that's where it gets, all the seabirds get hit by it, all the fish that everyone cares about get hurt. And the deep water corals, on the other hand, not many people knew about them, and then also weren't sure about what was going to happen as a result of the dispersant. And so I feel like that was probably the big lesson, was that those deep water communities are pretty vulnerable. And we're still learning about what exactly the consequences of that are. It's a good question, though. Anything else?
I have more, but I can let other people ask. So was the oil eventually degraded by microbes?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that diagram kind of showed like all the droplets or whatever, this one. Yeah. So, I mean, evaporated, dissolved. So there's a lot of stuff that happened like at the surface too, stuff that like Bill Miller knows about. And then there was this, I'd say this pool, the oil that formed surface slicks and tar balls, that would be eventually degraded by microbes. And if it makes this to the shore, it's going to be degraded quicker than if it went to the deep water.
Okay. Is there like a refractory oil slick though that sticks to the bottom that we're not able to see evidence of degradation, or does all of it eventually get degraded?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I know that whatever makes it to the deep part of the Gulf definitely sticks around a lot longer, just because of the microbes being so much slower in their activity. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure of the exact signature. I know there are studies of fish that burrow in the sediments. They have evidence that they're still kind of removing a lot of the chemicals in the oil, like these, PAHs. And so there is kind of this, depending on where the fish lives, it's more exposed to oil than other places. And so that does suggest that there's a bit more in the sediments. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly how long a signature would last, but I'm definitely sure it'd be environment dependent.
Yeah.
Adam, this is Wayne.
Yes.
We have an online question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Would you care to comment on the migrating sargassum? I hope I pronounced that right.
Oh yeah, the sargassum. Yeah, there's a big patch of sargassum that's about to, I guess, hit Florida. I don't really have any comment as far as what's causing it. I don't know. I know a lot of people who know more about that are looking into it, but yeah, maybe Natalie in our audience knows.
No, I saw that article recently. We've had large patches of sargassum before, but my understanding was this year it's through the roof.
Yeah,
There's a lot coming this way.
and it's been getting worse like recently, and this apparently this patch that's about to, I don't know if you want to call it a patch, but yeah, this giant bloom of sargassum is much bigger than in years past, which have also been pretty bad.
Yeah, the estimate I saw was the width of the US, which I wasn't sure if I read that correctly. That must be a very large patch.
Yeah.
Is
No,
that, I'm sorry, is that off the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic coast in Florida?
I think it's the Atlantic
Yeah,
and the Gulf. I don't know.
both.
Yeah, oh, that's right. Yeah, there's definitely sargassum in the Gulf too. But yeah, so it's coming over across the Atlantic to hit Florida. Interesting.
So we have one more here. Are there other areas similar to the Taylor Energy platform that could potentially fail given similar conditions? I mean, or has this been, oh, we fixed this problem now and we're not going to allow that to happen again?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I know the answer, but I can say that if there's any infrastructure from oil drilling that's out there and it's in a hurricane-prone environment, it wouldn't surprise me if there's something like this that would happen again. But I hope with all the work that the Cuvione group did, we'd be able to deal with it instead of kind of basically there's a lot of litigation and blaming that went around that basically caused no one to do much about it for 15 years. I would hope that we would deal with it quicker, but yeah, I mean, it was really shocking to learn about that because it's not that far from the coast. It is close to a very like sparsely populated area. So if there were oil like washing up into the marsh, probably not a lot of people to see it, but it's actually kind of ironic because they discovered how bad the Taylor Energy site was during Deepwater Horizon because they're out surveying that area looking for where the oil was coming out of Deepwater Horizon. And then they found this area where like it physically didn't make any sense. And so they were like, oh, wow, there must be another source of oil. And this Taylor Energy site that we knew about for a long time is a lot worse than they thought. So yeah, but yeah, I mean, when that platform is buried under a lot of sediment, there was a lot of the debate, at least in the legal world, was about how much was because of an active leak or how much was like left over from the mudslide and just like stuck in the sediment. And so, yeah, it was hard to figure out exactly what was happening. But it became pretty clear that it was an active leak over time.
Okay. Well, that's all I have. Anybody else in there?
Yeah, we can keep going, but it's up to you.
You can go for it. Yeah,
Okay.
we got one more.
Oh, just one more? Okay. Then, so in one of the figures you showed nitrogen and the role that it might have been playing in a cranium bloom in the Gulf of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
But where was that nitrogen coming from in that event where it was high? And then it didn't seem very high, like it was less than 1 micromolar. So is the thinking that it was nitrogen, or could it have been other biological effects contributing?
So I wasn't involved with that study, but I knew people on it. And I think from that paper, the main message was that the ratios of N to P got closer to what was optimal. And so it wasn't that it was like really high nitrogen. We can go back to it, but it wasn't that it was super high nitrogen, but it was that it got closer to the ratio that those phytoplankton like, and that might have led to the bloom. But the water itself was definitely like they made this pretty clear connection to the remnants of that tropical storm that went over. So it dumped a ton of rain in the southeast U.S. and then you had a lot of freshwater runoff. And I think that paper also had some figures showing this pulse of fresh water too. I had to kind of like condense it down for the talk, but yeah, it's a good question. But yeah, it's not like overwhelming amounts, but I think it was just the timing of that bloom being pushed there, and then the somewhat favorable conditions made by the remnants of the hurricane that helped it blow up. Anything else? We can call it there.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay,
Well,
thank you very
all.
much,
Appreciate
Adam.
it.
We appreciate it.
you
See you
bet.
next month, everyone.
All right.